What is two-phase experiment versus one-phase experiment? You may have seen these hyphenated scary words in academic journal papers or at conferences. While they sound scary, the difference between those two types of experiment is very simple. It comes down to at how many points in time did you actually collect the data, whether you've done it in one go or whether you have split it over several phases. This is a very simple and easy distinction, and I have a calendar on the background for you to remember what this type of experiment is all about. Before I proceed any further, a bit of a disclaimer. I will be using examples from several academic papers. I'm not promoting those journals, I'm not promoting those papers. They come from my wider readership of the literature, my desire to understand experiments because I love them, and I'm using them only as examples for you to understand what a two-phase versus one-phase experiment can look like. This is how I would visualize one-phase data collection experiment. It basically means that you collect all your variables at one point in time, which means you are measuring your mediator, your control variables, sociodemographics, other confounding or extraneous variables, and your dependent variable at one point in time after you've executed your experimental manipulations. Easy, right? In case of the two-phase data collection, as the name suggests, you are collecting your data over two phases. And usually there is some logic, some very strategic, pragmatic planning that triggers you to collect your set of data across two phases. So now you may be wondering, well, can you give me an example when this type of design should be more appropriate versus one phase? The first example when two phases data collection is required is pre and post experiment. I have a separate video on this channel dedicated specifically to this type of experiment. If you haven't watched it before watching this video, please pause and find and have a look at it so that it is much clearer to you. But pre and post measurement experiment is basically about the extent of change in our dependent variable. And we are choosing to collect data over two phases because we want to see whether the scores on the dependent variable actually change after the intervention and which intervention results in greater changes. This is why we need to collect data over two phases for our dependent variable, pre-exposure measurement and post-exposure measurement. What is important for the two-phase data collection or pre and post measurement experiment is that you oversample at phase one, at time one, because not all participants who took part in this phase one research may be willing or may have time to take part in the second phase of your research. So you expect that there will be some sample attrition. You may lose some participants. So recruit a bit more, let's say 30% more, assuming that not all of them will participate in your research. Another example where you may want to split your data collection over two phases for the experiment is when you have very long questionnaires. When, for example, you need to capture their sociodemographic data, or you have long set of questions that measures skills or knowledge, or they have to complete a particular task. In this case, it is good to split it over several phases and make them completed before they actually see your experimental intervention or your experimental manipulation. And it is much better than squashing it towards the end of your survey because that increases participant fatigue and the dropout rates. This is important because as people get tired, they may not provide very thoughtful or careful responses. They just want to finish the task and leave the lab or online portal where you executed your experiment. In this case, you would collect all the required sociodemographic data at time one, and at time two, you would actually execute your experiment. And then you would use this sociodemographic data, knowledge, and skills that you've collected as moderators or as control variables when you model the effect of your independent variable, of your experimental manipulation on the dependent variable. Another instance where two-phase data collection is suitable is when you want to minimize participants getting the purpose of the research. Because in this case, if you are measuring very sensitive topics or topics that have some social desirability bias in their response, it's better to split over several points in time. And like I said before, collect all that attitudinal perceptions data actually here. And after some weeks, after some time, invite them for the main experiment. Another instance where you may want to split your data collection over several phases is when you have a strong moderator hypothesis. A moderator is usually something that annuls or strengthens or changes the relationship between your experimental intervention and, let's say, the mediator, or between it and the dependent variable. I have a separate video on the moderator. If you don't know what it's about, please have a look at it. But in this case, what you would like to do is to actually collect it at separate point in time, so you minimize the possibility of your participants guessing the purpose of your research if your hypothesis is saying that that particular individual differences in consumers would have significant impact on how your intervention is perceived and processed. Let's have a look at example. This one comes from the Journal of Consumer Research, paper from 2023 by Zhao, Cotte, and Cui. And they were looking at the impact of linear versus cyclical temporal perspective on pro-environmental intention and behaviors. And they used prior green values as a moderator for their main effect for the temporal perspective, and they decided to collect it at two phases, at 2 points in time. The moderator was collected at phase 1, and then they measured the pro-environmental intention and behavior after they exposed them to the temporal perspective manipulation in phase 2. If you're interested to know more, you can always read this paper, but I'm not going to go into lots of detail. It's just an example for you to contextualize this better. But if we also look at the visualization of the moderator, I should say here that the conventional visualization of the moderator should be here. Here it's kind of too far away and naturally looks much better here. This is what I see in most academic journals that I read. I just thought I would make this very clear and acknowledge the proper visualization of the moderator. If you need to collect your data over 3 points in time, that would be a 3-phase data collection. The usage of 1-phase data collection versus 2 versus 3 and so on depends on your design, the complexity of the phenomenon that you're studying. If you choose to collect your data this way, you really need to explain in your dissertation or in your journal publication or in a manuscript draft how you went about collecting data. This is important because we always need to describe our methodology in depth and detail when we do research. These are the rules that we need to follow. Now, this is everything for 2-phase experiment versus 1-phase experiment. To best remember the difference between the two is if you collect your data at 1 point in time, then it's a 1-phase experiment. If you split it over time, just I have calendar here on the screen for you to better remember it, it's a 2-phase experiment. If you have more points in time over which you collect data, then it would have a 3-phase experiment, and so on and so forth. I hope now you're very excited about your experiment and you feel empowered and you've got the knowledge.